We are officially in the 2025 offseason, so let's dive into some Dynasty running back rankings as we head into rookie draft season. Starting off with Tier 1, just a very simple two players. You know who they are, Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs, and that is my specific order as well. The reason that I prefer Bijan over Gibbs still is because Bijan is a bell cow. I mean, he had over 300 carries this year, another 60 receptions, 1,900 total yards, 15 total touchdowns, and that includes those games at the start of the year when the Falcons basically forgot who Bijan Robinson was. But from week 7 on, Bijan had 20 plus carries in 7 of 11 games, caught 3 or more receptions in 7 out of 11 games, and was on a 17-game pace of nearly 2,100 total yards and 19 touchdowns. That is insane production. Jahmyr Gibbs, on the other hand, was excellent to end the year, but that is mostly because David Montgomery was hurt. I think people forget how not overly elite Jahmyr Gibbs was for most of the season. In fact, from weeks 1 through 14, Gibbs was the RB6 in points per game, and Bijan was the RB5, but they were separated by almost a full fantasy point per game. Gibbs had only 3 20-plus point games over that stretch. Bijan Robinson had 7 20-plus point games, and the reason for that was because of David Montgomery, who was the RB11 in points per game to Gibbs' RB6. Now, Gibbs is a phenomenal fantasy running back and more than deserving of being the RB2 overall in Dynasty, but not RB1 overall, in my opinion, like a lot of people have him. To me, that is still very easily Bijan Robinson. Now, Tier 2 is another small tier of 3 more very young stud running backs in Breece Hall, Achane, and Kyren Williams. And to just quickly run through these guys, we'll start with Kyren and work our way up. Kyren Williams is fantastic. He was the RB7 in total points, RB10 in points per game in 2024, 350 touches, almost 1,500 total yards, 16 touchdowns. I mean, what more could you possibly want from your stud RB1? Blake Corum is a non-factor for him, and so Kyren Williams is just phenomenal. He's here, RB5. Achane was also great this year, but in the complete opposite way of how he produced in 2023. In 2023, he averaged 7.8 yards per carry and only 2.5 receptions per game. Then in 2024, he averaged 4.5 yards per carry, but bumped up his receiving work to 4.5 receptions per game. So even though he basically lost half of his rushing efficiency, he doubled his receiving output, and in PPR leagues, that was phenomenal and allowed him to finish as a top 5 fantasy running back. And I think what's even crazier were his splits with and without Tua this year. He averaged only 8.5 fantasy points per game without Tua and over 22 points per game with Tua. In fact, over 17 games with Tua, Achane would have been on pace for over 100 receptions, 820 yards, and 9 touchdowns just from the receiving game, which is essentially like Marvin Harrison Jr.'s stat line this year for yards and touchdowns, while also pacing for 900 yards and 7 touchdowns on the ground, which was basically DeAndre Swift's stat line. So with Achane, you get Marvin Harrison Jr. and DeAndre Swift in one player, which is just absolutely crazy. My only real concern with Achane is if Miami decides to draft a thumper in this year's class. I'm talking about a player who has tremendous success with those short yardage and goal line situations that he could steal away some of those opportunities from Achane. Achane's goal line numbers this year were actually kind of bad. He had 12 carries inside the 5, which was 15th most among running backs last year. He only had -1 rushing yards on those 12 carries and only 3 touchdowns. For reference, James Cook had 13 carries inside the 5, totaled 12 yards, and scored 6 times, so was twice as effective as Achane and is also not that big of a dude either. In fact, out of everyone with 3 rushing touchdowns inside the 5, Achane and Aaron Jones were the only 2 running backs who needed over 8 carries to score those touchdowns. Most everyone else did it on honestly under 5 or fewer carries. So my fear is that if Miami does something wild and they draft like Cam Skattebo or Raheem Sanders in the NFL draft this year, Achane is probably going to lose those touches to the bigger ground and pound back. Plus, if Skattebo or Sanders or whoever it ends up being proves to be able to do anything more, then they could still work between the 20s. It is really, really weird. And I'm not totally projecting that to happen this year, but it could, and that concerns me. Still though, at least for right now, Achane is easily a top 5 dynasty running back, and if he truly survives the offseason, is in for another elite 2025. And then we get to Breece Hall, who is still my RB3, maybe to some people's surprise, but just no longer in tier 1 with Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs like he was before 2024. And this is entirely based upon the fact that I personally believe that Breece Hall, the talent, is elite. I think a lot of the issues this year for fantasy stemmed from a poor offense or offenses with the coaching changes, a quarterback who really only seemed to care about himself and his best friend at wide receiver, and a complete lack of red zone work. Breece Hall had 19 carries inside the 20, which was 39th at the running back position last year. 39th for Breece Hall. He had fewer red zone carries than Kenneth Gainwell and Alexander Mattison, and only one more carry than Ray Davis. And just to prove that this is an offense and quarterback issue, Braylon Allen had 10 red zone carries himself. It's the same number as Carson Steele. So it's not like Breece Hall was just losing all this red zone work to Braylon Allen. Neither of them were getting red zone work. Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson were both top 8 in the NFL in red zone targets. So when the Jets got near the end zone, they passed the ball way more than they ran, and I blame the offense and I blame Aaron Rodgers. So my hope is that as this Jets team gets completely overhauled, we're talking new coaching staff, new offense, new quarterback, no more Devontae Adams. With all of these new changes for 2025, where does the identity of their offense return to? Breece Hall. And with that comes a return to elite fantasy production like we saw in 2022 before he got hurt, and like we saw in 2023. All right, now moving on, tier 3 is very simple. It is just Saquon Barkley. I can't put him in tier 2 because he's 27 years old, about to be 28, and on principle alone, I cannot put a 28-year-old running back in my top 5, no matter how elite that player is. Example 1, Christian McCaffrey this year. His value has plummeted because of an injured season, and if the same thing happens to Saquon, well, that's just no bueno. If you're in a startup, I would not touch Saquon Barkley with a 10-foot pole at his ADP. And if you already have him in your dynasty leagues, I would be actively trying to move him for any of these other top 5 running backs immediately. All right, kicking off tier 4 at my RB7 spot is Bucky Irving. Yes, a day 3 running back ranked at RB7, but I don't care, and neither should you. Bucky is phenomenal. I mean, on the season, he broke 1,100 rushing yards, another 400 receiving yards, 8 touchdowns, and post-Buccaneers bye week, he was even better. He was on a 17-game pace of 2,000 total yards, 10 touchdowns on 320 touches. And that includes the game that he got hurt in and only played 16% of snaps. I mean, my goodness, man. If this was Jonathan Brooks doing this, he would be a top 3 running back ahead of Breece Hall, but because it's day 3 Bucky Irving, he's here at RB7, and I honestly even debated him over Saquon Barkley too. He's just that good. I trust the player. I trust the Buccaneers. By Bucky Irving. Then RBs 8, 9, and 10 are 3 veterans that we know and I would say mostly love. Most of us love these guys. Jonathan Taylor, Kenneth Walker, and James Cook. Now, all 3 of these guys were top 12 running backs on the year in fantasy points per game. Jonathan Taylor actually very quietly, I think, finished 4th in rushing yards this year as his 2nd best season of his career. James Cook found the end zone a ton and was a huge part of this new Bills offense without Stephon Diggs. Then Kenneth Walker, even though he fought through injuries for a lot of the year, was the RB7 in points per game through week 12 before really being done for the year and put up 3 20-plus point games over that stretch, the same number as Jahmyr Gibbs through those weeks. So all 3 of these guys are rock-solid RB1s, and I'd be happy to have any of them. Now at RB11, we get to another really fun conversation. I currently have Chase Brown in what I'm going to call tier 4B right now, so not a tier 5 guy, but just doesn't feel as solid enough just yet as a tier 4 guy. And there are a few reasons for this for me. Number 1, he is a day 3 pick. And I know I just said that I don't care about that for Bucky Irving, but the sentiment around Bucky was that he more likely fell to day 3 because of his combine. Chase Brown was projected there the entire time through draft season and still even went later on day 3 in his draft than Bucky Irving did this past season. And the reason that scares me a little bit more for Chase Brown is that he didn't push his way onto the field last year behind Joe Mixon, and he didn't even really win the starting job this year over Zach Moss. He proved more and more each week that he should have been the starter from day 1, but it took a Zach Moss injury to really propel Chase Brown into the back that we know now, and there was no competition on his own team for touches behind him once Zach Moss got hurt. And that leads me into my second concern, competition for touches next year. My worry is that Cincinnati looks at their backfield and they draft another running back in this very deep and very solid running back class to complement Chase Brown. Brown can still be the RB1 on the team, but with overall less touches, that'll equal less production, and less production should equal less dynasty value, especially at the running back position. To me, there are two comparisons for Chase Brown's breakout season and then how he might be viewed heading into 2025. Both of them we actually just got last summer. He can either be Kyren Williams 2.0 or he can be Rachaad White 2.0. In both of these cases, both guys were massive volume guys in 2023 and fantastic fantasy running backs, but also in both cases, their teams drafted a 2024 rookie, and that initially disrupted each of their values just by their teams drafting someone last May, and it affected Kyren way more than Rachaad White because Kyren was valued much higher. Now fast forward to today, we know that Blake Corum didn't affect Kyren Williams, and Kyren is my RB5 still, but we also know that Bucky Irving completely stole Rachaad White's lunch money, and now Rachaad White went from Dynasty RB10 last January to now Dynasty RB34 on Keep Trade Cut. And guess what? Chase Brown is the RB11 on Keep Trade Cut there right now. So it all comes down to which player does Cincinnati draft and what is their intent with that rookie. I was adamant all last summer that Kyren Williams was better than Blake Corum, and Corum was more of an indictment on Ronnie Rivers and Zach Evans and anyone else behind Kyren than Kyren Williams himself. But Bucky Irving was really a wild card because his film was great, but his combine sucked, and that allowed Tampa Bay to get him at that round 4 discount. So which one of those paths does Cincinnati take this year? And are you willing to gamble that Chase Brown is Kyren Williams 2.0 versus the risk of being Rachaad White 2.0? All right, moving on here. Tier 5 is a big tier of all of the very productive but older kind of guys. This is where Dynasty and Redraft really start to connect because after really these top 10 or 11 guys that we've already hit on, I don't really care all that much about longevity, and I only start to really care about production. So tier 5 goes Josh Jacobs, Christian McCaffrey, David Montgomery, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, and Joe Mixon. Josh Jacobs is the youngest on this list at 26 years old, almost 27. He was the RB6 in total points, RB8 in points per game as the workhorse back for Green Bay, and I don't really see how that stops. Christian McCaffrey is here at RB13 because it is still Christian McCaffrey. I mean, we've played this injury game with him before, and it didn't matter then, and I don't think it matters now. Any running back can get hurt, but when Christian McCaffrey is 100% fully healthy, he is the best running back in fantasy football. David Montgomery is next as the second youngest player in this tier, so he gets a slight nod for longevity over the 3 guys I have behind him. Plus, he's an incredible offense that supported him as a top 15 back in points per game 2 years in a row. Plus, he has the same upside that Jahmyr Gibbs has, that if either one of them get hurt, the other has that entire backfield to themselves, which we saw how great that was for Gibbs, and I think it would be equally as great for David Montgomery. Then as for Henry, Kamara, Mixon, I mean, you guys know the drill here. They're old, but they're elite. Even on new offenses for 2 of them this year, don't overthink it. Just enjoy the production they're going to give you. Moving to tier 6, it is another smaller tier of 3 players where all of these guys are young enough and talented enough that they could be up in that tier 4 or 4B range with Chase Brown, but something is holding them back from getting there right now. First, we have Isiah Pacheco, who I think would be in the top 10 if he had stayed healthy this year because it really looked like he was going to do something great before he got hurt. And then unfortunately, I was right about his production after the injury. He barely played. He was the 1B to Kareem Hunt. He was very inefficient. He paced for just 680 total yards over his last 5 games coming back from injury. It just was not good once he came back. But I don't want to judge Isiah Pacheco based on his return because I knew that that would happen. It's the same injury that Tank Dell had that caused him to be bad for really all of last year. The same one that Mark Andrews had that caused him to be bad last year to start the year. But then he ended the year looking like Mark Andrews again. And it's the same injury that Tony Pollard had to end 2022 that caused him to look bad in 2023 up until about Thanksgiving. And now Tony Pollard is Tony Pollard again on a new team. So I have hope that Isiah Pacheco can get back to form by mid-season in 2025, but until I really see him get back to that form, he's still down here in tier 6. Next on the list is Chuba Hubbard, whose dynasty value just continues to hold basically as Jonathan Brooks unfortunately injured his knee again at the end of this year. Now, Chuba himself is a great running back, produced exceptionally well this year, that I would love to put him in tier 4, but he's always just going to have this shadow of Jonathan Brooks behind him for the next year or two. And that may not actually matter. Chuba could be the RB1 all year in 2025 with Jonathan Brooks recovering, could be the RB1 even for most of 2026 as well. But if I had Chuba on my Dynasty team, I would be anxiously watching him just in case he slipped up or got hurt himself. That would then give Dave Canales a reason to turn to Jonathan Brooks, and then Chuba might never get the RB1 role back if that does happen. So that's why he's here, still in the top 20, but not any higher than this. And the last tier 6 player is Brian Robinson, who still actually has not had a season with over 800 rushing yards, but he did score 8 times in 14 games last year. And if we look at just the 10 games where he played at least 45% of snaps, so removing the couple games that he got hurt in, and then essentially week 18, Brian Robinson was on a 17-game pace of over 1,100 rushing yards, 250 more receiving yards, and 9 total touchdowns, which is more or less Chuba Hubbard's stat line this year. So hopefully in 2025, we can get a fully healthy season in this new high-powered Commanders offense, and Brian Robinson can have his best fantasy year yet. Okay, now tier 7 is the biggest tier that we've had so far, and it's just filled with players that are just bodies, essentially. I mean, they're not overly productive. They're not even that consistent on a weekly basis. And if you get more than 2 years out of these guys, then that's absolutely fantastic. They're all just here. So first we have Tony Pollard, who is the oldest player in this tier. He produced well in Tennessee and was the absolute RB1 over Tyjae Spears, basically up until Pollard got hurt at the end of the year, but should be a solid RB2, even better RB3 for another year or two. Then we have Travis Etienne, and I could maybe see him moving into tier 6, but really not much higher than that because I think he scarred too many people this year, and when that happens in Dynasty, your value is basically kind of screwed. I am hopeful that his 2024 season was in large part due to the injuries that he sustained, and maybe he does need a change of scenery to revitalize his career, but I like the upside. Even the floor isn't necessarily terrible, so he's right here in this tier. Najee Harris is up next, third on this tier, only really because he is a free agent. So if he doesn't stay in Pittsburgh, what does that mean for his role and usage on a new team? He has been one of the most volume-dependent backs in fantasy for basically his entire career, so any hit to that volume could be really bad for his fantasy value. I mean, maybe he's the one that ends up in Miami and they bring in for a compliment to Devon Achane, kind of like their version of Gibbs and David Montgomery, or maybe he takes a cheap deal just to stay in Pittsburgh. Who really knows? That uncertainty is what makes him third in this tier for me, though. J.K. Dobbins is up next, and a very interesting name after resurrecting his career in L.A. He is also a free agent, though, so maybe the Chargers re-sign him and just run it all back again for their backfield, or maybe he's a potential RB1 signee with Vegas or Minnesota or Cleveland. I don't really know. We'll see. More uncertainty, but also a little bit of upside. Then we have Tyrone Tracy, who did well taking over the starting role for the New York Giants, but I just don't fully trust him being the starter again in 2025. I mean, I'd be all for it. I honestly think that he should be the starter in 2025, but he is a day 3 pick who wasn't even the planned starter going into the season, and now the whole team is getting a facelift with a new quarterback, more receiver weapons probably. Maybe they even draft another running back in this deep running back class. Possibly even a new coach by midseason, with Brian Daboll being on the absolute hottest of hot seats. It just feels like Dameon Pierce 2.0, which sucks because I do think that Tyrone Tracy is actually a good running back, but he could just be a victim of complete organizational turnover and just be a fun name to look back on in 3 to 4 years. Rhamondre Stevenson comes in at RB26 for being the workhorse RB1 in New England. He did sign that 4-year extension before the season started, so it looks like the Patriots are at least committed to him for another year or two before he really is a cap casualty. And even though the Patriots offense wasn't that great this year, Stevenson was still on a 17-game pace of almost 1,000 rushing yards, 8 total touchdowns, another 40 receptions up through week 16. So with a hopefully improved offense in 2025 with a year 2 Drake May, Stevenson should be a fine RB2 or flex guy with weekly upside in 2025. Next up then is DeAndre Swift, who really just feels fine. All of the luster and shine from DeAndre Swift's name has been lost over the years since being booted from Detroit, being booted from Philadelphia. Now he's the RB1 in Chicago, but he couldn't even get to 1,000 yards in 17 games on over 250 carries. I mean, maybe his production spikes with a new offense in place in 2025 and this team just improves overall, but I'm done with thinking that DeAndre Swift will ever be anything more than a back-end RB2 with some spike weeks here and there. And then Rachaad White is still here at RB27 for me just because he was still productive enough even when Bucky Irving was doing his thing. He has a lot of receiving upside. He can still break off those big runs on the ground, and the Buccaneers offense is potent enough that both he and Bucky Irving could score in the same games. Plus, the handcuff upside of being the RB1 if Bucky Irving were to get hurt, as we saw in Week 14 against the Raiders, is what keeps Rachaad White here inside the top 30. And finally, I appended the last two names to Tier 8 just to round out my top 30 with the two old guys left, James Conner and Aaron Jones. Conner does have 2 years left in Arizona now that he signed the extension, which is really just 1 year and then a team option, but staying in Arizona, at least for 2025, is great for James Conner rather than testing free agency like Aaron Jones is going to have to do this year. So we'll see where Aaron Jones ends up, if he's back in Minnesota for cheap or someone else is a depth piece like Zeke to the Patriots or Dalvin Cook to the Jets kind of thing. Oh, and if I were to include the rookie running backs in this tier list today in January, I would plug Ashton Jeanty into tier 1B, or more like the top of tier 2, because he is a blue chip prospect that we hope lands in an ideal spot for immediate production, but I would take Jeanty over every running back in Dynasty right now, not named Bijan Robinson or Jahmyr Gibbs. Omarion Hampton is my clear-cut rookie RB2, and he would slide right into that tier 4B with Chase Brown. Again, hoping for a great landing spot for immediate production, but I also believe that Hampton is talented enough that he could beat out a veteran-type player by the end of 2025 and then be great for 2026 and beyond. And then I'm just going to group together Caleb Johnson, Quinshon Judkins, and Travion Henderson, put them into tier 6 with the potential to move up or down given draft capital and landing spot, because I really just don't have a read right now on how the NFL views these guys, but they all have upside should they land in a good to great spot. So there is my current top 35 Dynasty running back rankings with the top rookies included now that we're officially into the 2025 offseason. Make sure to drop any and all questions in the comments down below. Call me an idiot if you want, but also make sure that you're subscribed either way for more Dynasty content for the rest of 2025.